to the Warfender Dossier. This is a slightly different series to my historical videos, in that this actually focuses on the gameplay aspect rather than the history of the vehicle, although I will provide a small amount of history at the beginning of the video. So I'm going to be talking about how the vehicle performs in game, its quirks, its pros and cons, weak spots, and things like mobility, armament, protection, and so on. Basically a miniature review of the vehicle and how it performs within War Thunder. First of all, as you may have noticed from the title, the Tiger II is going to come under the magnifying glass, so to speak. The Tiger II was introduced in mid to late 1944. Production started before then, but of course at this time the Allied bombing campaign was well and truly underway, with 1,000 bomber raids almost becoming a nightly mission over the skies of Germany, and very vital and important factories and plants central to the war effort were being pounded into dust over and over again. But despite this, the Germans did manage to scrape together enough resources to produce just under 500 Tiger IIs. The first 50 were fitted with this turret you can see here. Both turrets were designed by Krupp. First turret was designed to be fitted to Porsche's hull, but Krupp was convinced that Porsche would win the contract, so they produced 50 of these turrets, to fit to that hull in the event that they did win, which they were hoping they did, because they'd built 50 of these turrets. But unfortunately for them, it was Henchel's design which won the contract. As you can see here, this is the Henschel hull. But with a few modifications, the turret could be fitted to the hull. The rest of the King Tigers, after the first 50, were fitted with this turret, the so-called production turret, often known as the Henschel turret, because it was designed to be fitted to the Henschel hull. It's larger and heavier, but it also provides better protection, but I'll get to that later on. So the Tiger II first went into action in early July 1944. Just after the Allies had created a beachhead and pushed inland into northern France and heading down towards Paris. So about a month, just over a month after the D-Day landings. Initial combat performance was satisfactory, although a few vehicles were lost because Allies had overwhelming air superiority, so Tiger IIs were lost from attacks to the air, usually bombs. Occasionally rockets did do damage, but they weren't very accurate. And of course, reconnaissance planes relayed the position of these huge tanks to units on the ground, so they could go around them and flank them. But usually the camouflage was rather effective, so much like the Tiger I, the Tiger II laid in ambush and waited for its enemies to move into its field of view and engage them from usually very long range whenever possible. That was when the Tiger performed best, when it was so far away from the enemy that it couldn't reciprocate because penetration simply dropped off too much. Whereas the Tiger's huge 88mm could penetrate virtually all Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The first Tiger IIs saw action on the Eastern Front in September of 1944, where again they performed rather well, mostly due to the very thick armour and the powerful gun. They probably performed better than on the Western Front because the rolling steppes in the open fields provided more opportunities for the Tiger II to set up firing solutions to aid in the huge battles that were occurring where the masses of Russian armour were racing towards the German defensive lines, and the Tiger IIs would sit back and pick them off wherever possible. But overall the Tiger II performed its job. It was usually set up in a static defensive role, but it did perform some attacking missions, for example in the Battle of the Bulge, where a huge amount of Tiger IIs. I think it was 70 or 80, which is quite a lot to be massed in one offensive, because they only ever had a couple hundred operational at one time. The Tiger IIs pushed forward and acted as breakthrough tanks, much like the Russian IS-2s. They could perform in this role because they were well armoured, but they were slow and rather vulnerable. And also, the fuel requirements were massive, which is why the German offensive ground to the halt. One of the main reasons, they simply ran out of fuel, and they had no fuel to bring up and replace it because fuel reserves were almost nothing by this point in the war. So that's a brief history of the tank. Very heavy. It comes in at just over 70 tons, so just over 5 tons heavier, I believe, than the Elephant. Sorry, 68 tons. My mistake. Oh, where's the Ferdinand? 65, okay. It's 3 tons heavier than the Ferdinand, but the power-to-weight ratio is better. Top speed is 42, although in-game it'll only show 41. I believe it's in the late 41, sort of 41.8, 41.9. Going downhill, you can reach up to 44, but you have to be going down a very steep slope for that. Usually you hover around 42. Turn rate is poor in first gear, although, like with most German tanks, if you shift up a few gears, the turn rate dramatically increases. So fourth gear is optimal for the Tiger II, same as the Tiger I. In fourth gear you will turn pretty well. Acceleration is quite good. Gears 1 to 7 are very short compared to the 8th and final gear. Initial acceleration is okay, but the faster you go, the acceleration picks up until you reach your top speed of 41. 41 kilometers an hour is very good for a tank of this size and weight. Contrary to popular belief, the Tiger and Tiger II weren't these sluggish behemoths that were barely capable of pulling their own weight. They were actually pretty sprightly, although the engines were a little bit underpowered for the weight they were being made to pull. But they made it work. So mobility, overall, in the grand scheme of things, the mobility is not good, but for a heavy tank it is good. You can keep up with an IS-2 in a straight line. Let me just verify the top speed. 38, okay. You can actually go faster than the IS-2, but the IS-2 is a bit lighter, so it's going to get to its top speed a bit faster. Armour. Front armour. This is the best armoured part of the tank, as you'd expect. The upper glacis is 150mm, sloped at 45 degrees, which is equivalent to just under 200mm of flat steel. The lower plate is only 100. That's a definite weak spot. This is probably the largest weak spot, because I think this is just about equivalent to around 150mm of flat steel, something like that. Even the T-44's gun can penetrate this. The T-44 probably has the worst Tier 4 gun, as far as I can remember. The machine gun port, that's not really an obvious weak spot. Like in World of Tanks, maybe if you actually shoot where the machine gun sticks out, but the bulbous area isn't really a recommended weak spot. The gun itself, huge muzzle brake. If you shoot that, you're probably going to kill it. Depending on the caliber of your weapon, of course. If you hit it with an 85mm, you might not get it in one shot, but an IS-2's gun, you're going to snap that in half, basically, and the Tiger II will be screwed. At least until he repairs it, if he can repair it. Side armour is 80, including the area beneath the sponson, behind the mudguards, that's also 80, although the lower half of the hull is protected by the road wheels. Rear armour is also 80, and that's sloped downwards. The roof armour, I believe, is 25, something like that. The turret front is 100 on the early production turret, and the sides and rear are 80. But there's a lot of sloping going on in this turret. Although if you hit this area here, you'll probably kill the commander. The turret ring is quite a large target on this tank. Not quite as large as the... or obvious, shall I say. It's larger than the T-34's turret ring, but it's not quite as obvious. As you can see here, it really sticks out on the T-34, especially on the 85. See that there? Usually hitting the turret ring on a T-34 85 will blow it up. So that's just a side tip there. The front is, I believe, right at the apex here is about 110. It's obviously very well sloped, so hitting the middle section is not easy. I believe this patch of metal here is around 20, so it's not really viable to hit because the Tiger II is such a high tank that you're probably going to be looking at it at that sort of angle, so that's such an extreme slope, it's not worth shooting at. There is a shot trap here beneath the lower half of the mantlet, no, not the mantlet, the turret front. So if you hit this area here, the shots can potentially bounce down onto the very thin turret hull roof, which is one of the reasons this turret wasn't chosen for serial production. The mantlet, as I incorrectly named the turret front just now, is this little square here. The mantlet is very small for a tank of this size, but obviously it's still very, very tough. Shooting at the mantlet isn't really going to reap any significant damage. I mean, you may damage the cannon barrel, but it's not likely. So overall, if you're aiming at the Tiger II with the early production turret from the front, you want to aim for the lower hull or the turret. Potentially the gun, but that's quite a small target to hit from range. Now the armour on the next two, the so-called Henschel and the Henschel with the KWK-46, both the damage models are the same for these tanks, so I'll go over the first one. The hull is identical. Obviously the visual difference is the Henschel starts off in dunkelgelb, whereas the Porsche starts off with an actual camo. You can see the Zimmer on there. The turret is once again 80 all round, I believe, apart from the front. So 80 on the sides and 80 on the rear. The turret front is 180mm thick. So that's going to be difficult to penetrate unless you're driving an SE-100 and firing 1949 ammunition, which I'm not going to go into because I think that's a great injustice, but I suppose it offers a bit of balance maybe, but I'm going off track here. The mantlet is much larger than the Porsches, and it's thicker. It's top blender, similar to the late model Stug 3G's Zalkopf blender. Few track links on the turret provide a bit of extra protection. Otherwise, the two tanks are the same. The weight is virtually the same, I believe. A few hundred kilos difference. In real life, the weight difference is more significant, but I assume they haven't modelled that because there's not a great deal of point. Vertical guidance, 15 degrees upwards, that's adequate, and -8 downwards, that's very good. Not quite as good as some of the early German tanks, like the L, that's -10. The Tiger is also -8, but -8 is very good. It's much better than the Russians, which usually get around -5, I believe. Well, the IS-2 only has -2, which is terrible. Even a shallow hill is going to struggle to shoot down, so take advantage of your terrain and angle whenever possible. Like most German tanks, the the King Tiger really benefits from angling, so if you sort of like that sort of angle, you're going to really massively increase the potential spouts. So the gun itself, on the first two models, is the KWK-43. This KWK-46 is not historical, but I will cover it very quickly after I've covered the other two. So the KWK-46 is a very powerful gun. It's the same caliber as the first Tiger's gun, but the shell is longer and heavier. It's larger overall, even though the caliber is the same. The barrel is 71 calibers long, which creates an extremely high muzzle velocity, as you can see 1000 meters per second with standard armor-piercing capped ballistic cap, or 1200 meters a second with APCR. The shell weight is 10.2 kilos, which is pretty heavy. I believe it's a bit heavier than the Panzergranate 39 on here. Oh no, it's the same. My mistake. Yeah. Penetration is where it's at with this gun. 100 meters is the most relevant because that's around the distance that most engagements will happen. Unless you're on Kursk, most engagements will be between 100 and 400 meters. So you're going to have roughly 195 millimeters of penetration, which is enough for every Russian tank, apart from the T-44 and T-54. The T-44 you will struggle to penetrate at longer ranges because the hull is 100 millimeters thick, and it's also very well sloped at 35 degrees, I believe it is, so unless you're at point blank you're going to struggle. But the turret is a much easier target. Usually if you shoot a T-44's turret you'll destroy it in one hit, blow it up. Penetration drops off slowly, although even at 1,000 meters you're going to be able to penetrate pretty much the same tanks you could penetrate 100 meters. You can still penetrate an IS-2, although the model 1944 has a more protected hull than the original 43 model, so keep that in mind. APCR is overkill really at this tier. You don't really need that much penetration unless you're shooting at T-44s across the map, but that doesn't happen very often. And of course, the APCPC has an explosive filling, whereas the APCR does not, so the damage is going to be much better with this shell. And also you have the potential to over-penetrate and not do any damage at all with this shell. So, armor piercing is definitely the way to go. Reload time is 13.9 seconds, which is fairly slow, but really not that bad compared to what the Russians have to deal with. The IS-2 has a very slow reload, 27.1, so you're only going to manage just over 2 shells a minute with that gun because of the breech system, the weight of the shells, and the split ammunition, the 2-piece ammunition. Very difficult to reload. So compared to the IS-2, you've got a fast reload. Compared to the Tiger, I believe it's a little slower. Yes, but you've got more punch, so that's understandable. The armament on this final model, the KWK-46 L68, 105mm cannon. 20 seconds, it's fairly long, but still, it's not too bad for a gun of that size. Just a quick point about the battle ratings. In realistic battles, 5.7, 6.3 and 7.7. So the Henschel turret has a bit of a bump to its turret armor. Actually, the turret is significantly more protective, and the ammunition storage in real life was increased, but in-game that's not modelled. But you're not going to get through that much ammunition anyway, unless you're on Kursk sitting at the back. 50 shells is plenty for the KW-46, you won't use that many, but 3 shots a minute, that's not bad. Obviously that's with a stock crew. This is without training a crew, so with an expert crew and a few points into loading, you'll probably get that down to maybe 18.5 seconds. The penetration on this gun is immense. 210mm at 100 meters, and a 14 kilo shell weight, although the muzzle velocity has dropped a little. There's also the APC BC 39 model, which has a 1005 meter per second muzzle velocity, which is a lot higher than this, and also 5 meters a second faster than the KW-43, which it won't be noticeable, but it will be noticeable if you're comparing these two. The high explosive is not worth using. I'm not going to mention high explosive in this video because it's just not worth using. It doesn't have any real effect. Even at 1,000 meters, you're going to be probably maybe penetrating the hull of a T-44 if he's not angled. And then there's this thing, 256mm of penetration. You're probably going to need that for T-54s. Battle rating is 7.7, so you're going to see T-54s fairly often. The standard shell, I say standard, the upgraded standard armor piercing shell is good, but the T-54 has a lot of armor. The hull is only 100, but the slope is pretty crazy on it. And the turret as well, the hemispherical turret. The T-54 is a tough nut to crack, so you may struggle with standard AP. But then again, if you're at close range, you may not. Armour is the same as the Henschel model on this model. The size of that gun, it's huge. This, by the way, is the final gun in the World of Tanks King Tiger. You may recognise it. This is the L68. The camo is again slightly different. Switched to a late war model version of the camo, of course, because if this did see action, it would be very late war. But that's the 3 King Tigers currently in game. My overall verdict? Well, I've only driven the first one, but I imagine the second one will be quite similar. You do struggle with T44s occasionally. They can bounce, but aiming for the turret works. Mobility is nowhere near as good as the Panthers, but that goes without saying. But it's, for a heavy tank, it's okay, especially the top speed. The top speed's very good. The armament is second to none. This is one of the best guns in the game. The penetration, the muzzle velocity, the damage. The damage isn't going to be as good as, say, the 122 or the 100mm, because there's simply not as much explosive filler, but it's adequate. You'll one-shot most tanks. You may need 2 shots for an IS-2, but the penetration, the damage, the muzzle velocity, and the accuracy, of course. The KWK-43 is an excellent all-round gun, and it's on a very good platform. Of course, the Porsche turret is a bit more vulnerable than the Henschel turret, which is why the Henschel turret has a higher battle rating. So, that's the King Tiger. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Reach with the Sky. See you soon.